Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what does it take to earnestly practice meditation?
It takes commitment, zeal, faith, and wisdom. One must be committed to the path of enlightenment because it does not reward day trippers. One must have zeal, or else they will not overcome the obstacles that get in their way. One must have faith that meditation works, or else they won't even try. One must have wisdom, or else they won't know to start meditating in the first place.
Fascinating. It's interesting that these appear to be both the causes and the effects of meditation.
Precisely. If one practices meditation earnestly, they'll cultivate these qualities in themselves.
Does it become easier to meditate through repeated practice?
All things become easier and harder through repeated practice. If one practices every day, then it becomes easier to sit down and practice the following day. However, if they practice every day, then the process of meditation will become ever more subtle and mysterious.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing the 5 hindrances. What are the 5 hindrances? How does one overcome them? How have understandings of them changed over time? We hope you enjoy. So, what are the 5 hindrances?
The 5 hindrances are known as the 5 nivaranas in Sanskrit, and they're 5 mind states which are obstacles to the practice of meditation in Buddhism. As such, they must be overcome in order to earnestly and productively be able to practice meditation. Here is a list of what they are with their Pali name and a short definition. The first one is sensory desire, or kamacchanda, seeking for pleasure through the 5 senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and physical feeling. Ill will, or vyapada, feelings of hostility, resentment, hatred, and bitterness. Sloth and torpor, thinamidda, half-hearted action with little or no effort or concentration. Restlessness and worry. Uddhacca kukucca, the inability to calm the mind and focus one's energy. And finally, doubt. Vicikiccha, lack of conviction or trust in one's abilities. As you can see, it's fairly obvious how these interfere with meditative practice. If one is experiencing pain or discomfort, they will desire for the end of that pain or discomfort, and thus they will be distracted from the meditative practice they're doing unless they overcome that desire. On the other hand, if they're experiencing pleasure, the same applies, except that they'll desire for the continuation of that pleasure, and they won't be able to focus on meditation. This sort of thing can be caused by violating one of the 10 precepts, such as consuming an intoxicant, not observing sexual discretion, wearing perfume, sleeping on a luxurious bed, and so on. There are numberless causes for this sort of thing. Ill will is clear because when one harbors ill will, all they can really hold in their minds is the image of that person or the thing that caused them to have the ill will toward that person and the result of that ill will being realized. This is a defiled intention towards something or somebody which derives from some form of desire or unsatisfactoriness with the situation before you. Sloth and torpor is a fancy way of saying laziness, and it refers to the fact that meditation is work. It is a daily practice that involves mental effort. If you're practicing at the level of a monastic, you're essentially training to be an Olympic-level meditator. Olympic-level athletes have to overcome those days where they wake up and think to themselves, I'm tired and I don't feel like practicing. Monastics have to do the same thing, and regular people should try to as well. They get home from work and they think, I'm tired, I'll pick up meditation tomorrow, and this is what is captured by the idea of sloth and torpor. This can also be caused by intoxicants, by sensory desire, and everything else we mentioned before. Restlessness and worry essentially refers to what we conventionally call anxiety. It is some sort of fear or mental tension which causes your nervous system to be stimulated. This sort of thing can be caused by intoxicants, by ill will, and by other things. All of these 5 are very deeply interconnected, and their causes are also very interconnected. The last one is doubt, and that refers to a lack in confidence and conviction in your ability to do a thing, or a lack in confidence in the usefulness or productiveness of that thing itself. When applied to meditation, it's the belief that meditation simply won't work or that you won't do it well enough that it will work for you. Each of these things necessarily comes with an accompanying object of cognition, and that object can be anything at all that can be cognized by any of the 6 senses. In other words, it can be any small d dharma in the entire phenomenal universe. Sensory desire can take anything as the object of desire. Remember that consciousness is a sense in Buddhism, so sensory desire can attach to mind objects as well. If you're thinking of or imagining something that's pleasant or painful to imagine, then that is an instance of sensory desire, just like desiring for softer clothes, or a more comfortable seat, or a prettier room, or a better smelling incense, or any of that sort of stuff. The same applies for the other 4 hindrances as well. I want to mention that they can also take meditation themselves as their object. One can doubt their ability to meditate, or they can doubt the usefulness of meditation. One can have ill will toward another person, or toward themselves, but also they can have ill will toward meditation. Meditation, the concept, the word, the practice, all of these are small d dharmas, and they're just referents in the sense that they refer to the thing, but they are not the thing itself. And as a result, they can be objects of the hindrances. These 5 hindrances come up in the Samyutta Nikaya of the Pali Canon, and so they're very foundational teachings to Buddhism and to Buddhist practice. In fact, when we say meditation, or we say practice in the context of the 5 hindrances, we should note that these terms are historically vague. In other words, these hindrances are explained and clarified before the specifics of practice itself is really clarified in the terms that we're familiar with today. Of course, there is the Satipatthāna Sutta, which is also in the Pali Canon and which we've read and discussed. In that sutta, meditation practice is laid out rather specifically, but what I mean to say here about the 5 hindrances is that they are presented as obstacles to any Buddhist practice, including meditation, in all its forms. We have talked about how there is jhanic meditation, samatha meditation, vipassana meditation, and many others, and even they only constitute one part of Buddhist practice as a whole, and these 5 hindrances apply to them.
How does one overcome the hindrances?
This is a really good question because it is one that's not very strongly or clearly answered in the suttas, but is discussed in the commentaries. Since we're human beings, we can look at this list of 5 hindrances and see that there is not any one single medicine for all 5 or any one of the 5. Overcoming those hindrances is a matter of serious practice in itself. In fact, the issue of how to overcome the hindrances is extremely important because it holds within it a complicated question as to how to understand when somebody's practice begins and ends in Buddhism. For example, in a manner of speaking, one of the whole central motivations of the Buddha to strive to attain enlightenment was to overcome dukkha, which is directly caused by sensory desire. In that sense, isn't it then possible to say that if you have fully overcome sensory desire, then you are fully enlightened already? That would then give us a solid reason to question whether or not meditation is the path or the result of the path. In other words, we say that meditation practice earnestly and productively starts after you have overcome the 5 hindrances. In that sense, because of the issue I just brought up, it becomes an open question as to whether you meditate to get enlightenment or you meditate because you are already enlightened. That debate is still very much open and ongoing to this day. Regardless, to answer concretely, the literature gives a variety of answers to the question of how to overcome these hindrances. These answers give various practice or experience-based solutions to the hindrances. In the Satipatthāna Sutta, which we read and discussed, the Buddha presents the solution to the 5 hindrances in the following quote. How, monks, does a monk live contemplating mental objects in the mental objects of the 5 hindrances? Herein, monks, when sense desire is present, a monk knows, there is sense desire in me. Or when sense desire is not present, he knows, there is no sense desire in me. He knows how the arising of the non-arisen sense desire comes to be, he knows how the abandoning of the arisen sense desire comes to be, and he knows how the non-arising in the future of the abandoned sense desire comes to be. End quote. He repeats this formula 4 times more for the rest of the 5 hindrances. As you can see, this is not immediately clear or straightforward. When asked the question of how to overcome the hindrance, the Buddha responds essentially, know how to overcome the hindrance. As a result, the commentaries and the post-canonical texts become very important in answering this question. Buddhaghosa's 5th century commentary on the Samyutta Nikaya presents the solution of sensual desire being the first jhana based on bodily foulness. The solution to ill will is the first jhana based on metta, or loving kindness. The solution to sloth and torpor is perception of light. Restlessness and worry is solved by serenity. Doubt is solved by defining of phenomena. We should be careful with these solutions. The reason why is that some of them are contradictory in some interpretations of the relationship between the hindrances and meditation. If we take it for granted that we have to overcome the hindrances before we can even get to step 1 of meditation, then how can meditation itself be a solution to the hindrance? The first 2 hindrances, sensory desire and ill will, are solved by entering the first jhana of jhanic meditation. Sensory desire is solved by meditation on the foulness of the body, and ill will is solved by meditation on loving kindness and compassion. Understanding bodily foulness and loving kindness and compassion do seem like straightforward and self-explanatory solutions to their accompanying hindrances, but if we take it for granted that these are, capital T-S, the solutions to these hindrances, we have to think of the hindrances as not being obstacles in between the practitioner and step 1 of meditation, but instead being more like lead weights weighing you down in your practice. And the meditation that Buddhaghosa prescribes is a way to make those weights lighter. This is Buddhaghosa's interpretation of the nature of the hindrances, and we should note that this interpretation is not the only one out there. The following is another set of solutions given in the Theravada tradition. One of them is vitakka, applied thought or course examination, as a counteraction to sloth and torpor. Vicara, sustained thought or precise investigation, counteracts doubt. Piti, or rapture or well-being, counteracts ill will. Sukha, or non-sensual pleasure, counteracts restlessness and worry. Ekaggata, one-pointedness, single-pointed attention, counteracts sensory desire. These seem a little more sensible and straightforward. Focusing your attention not on sense objects, but on your practice gets rid of sensory desire. Focusing your mindset on joy or rapture counteracts malice and anger. Applying one's thought or intention strongly toward practice counteracts sloth and torpor. Mindfulness and calmness and contentedness counteract restlessness and worry. Finally, precise investigation into the nature of cause and effect or into the nature of one's ability counteracts doubt. These seem simple initially, but they can be very complicated, especially if the roots of the hindrances run very deep. As such, these represent a simple presentation of the solution to the hindrances. In this case, they are being interpreted as obstacles that stand in between the practitioner and step 1 of meditation. But these solutions seem like sensible ways of getting those obstacles out of the way for the purpose of beginning meditation earnestly and productively.
So, going over this list, perhaps in more localized terms, you could say something like sloth is overcome by effort or maybe diligence. Ill will is overcome by benevolence. Doubt is overcome by either effort or maybe curiosity. Anxiety is overcome by maybe serenity, and desire is overcome by focus. So I noted in the translations you give there, the word vicara, which translated to either sustained thought or precise investigation. Like, those are 2 pretty dissimilar translations. Guessing there's some precision that has perhaps been lost to time.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because the translation here, as with all of these Pali words and Sanskrit words, there's not really a one-to-one equivalent in English. And so when we have a word like vicara with these 2 seemingly distant translations, sustained thought, precise investigation, it can be hard to know what exactly is being referred to by that word. And I interpret it as being sustained thought that is applied toward understanding the nature of something, almost like Buddhaghosa's defining of phenomena that he mentioned a minute ago. So whenever you're doing precise investigation, you have to get down into the weeds of something, and in order to get down into the weeds of something, you have to sustain your focus. You have to sustain your thought process. And by doing so, by understanding really the very specific boundaries of meditation practice, of your own capabilities, of all of these concepts we've talked about so far, then all of your doubts will be done away with. It's like that anxiety, for example, is fear of the unknown, but if you come to know something in a very concrete fashion, then it's a lot more difficult to be anxious or worried about that thing. And doubt has some sort of overlap, some sort of relationship here with anxiety, in a sense that like you doubt something because you're not sure that it's going to work out the way that it says it's going to, or that you're told that it's going to. And so one way you can counteract that is through really sustained investigation, making sure that you do know for certain that something works the way it does. And in the pre-modern Theravada Buddhist sort of scheme, that meant reading a lot about meditation practice. It meant reading a lot and observing a lot and asking people, right? And so in that sense, it's much more of like a scientific kind of activity.
All right. Makes sense. So when the word vicara is translated as sustained thought, precise investigation, it's not really one or the other, it's both at once.
Right.
Okay.
I finally want to mention that these mind states that we call the hindrances are often juxtaposed next to the 7 factors of enlightenment to strike a contrast in the nature of the enlightened and unenlightened experience. In other words, since much of the Pali Canon is concerned with just generally describing stuff, we see that the unenlightened state is described in terms of the hindrances, and the 7 factors, which we will do a whole episode about soon, are given to describe somebody who is enlightened and their experience. We can see this as an encouragement to the disciples. The Buddha is saying all of the unenlightened people are bogged down by these problems, these 5 hindrances, but the enlightened people have these benefits. The 7 factors of enlightenment are mindfulness, maintaining awareness of reality, in particular the teachings of the Dharma, investigation of the nature of reality, energy, which can be like determination, effort, zeal, joy or rapture, relaxation or tranquility of both body and mind, concentration, a calm and one-pointed state of mind, bringing the buried latencies or samskaras into full view, equanimity, accepting reality exactly as it is without craving or aversion. These are presented as the opposite experience of the 5 hindrances and the result of overcoming those 5 hindrances and practicing meditation earnestly and productively.
How have understandings of the 5 hindrances changed over time?
One of the most important ways that they change as Buddhism develops from its early roots and into Mahayana and Theravada is that we don't see them discussed that much in the Mahayana. We've talked before about the Mahayana Canon, which is also called the Taisho Canon, but we should mention again, one of the portions of this Taisho Canon is a condensation or a collection of Pali Canon texts. This collection is called the Agamas. Agama is a Sanskrit equivalent for the Pali word Nikaya. These words mean collections or bundles of scrolls, and in their usage here they refer to some of these collections that we've read from in our sutra episodes, the Digha Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, and so on and so forth. There are 5 Nikayas, or Agamas, and these 5, plus translations and versions of the Abhidharma texts and the monastic texts, all make their way into the Mahayana Taisho Canon, and are thus not forgotten. It's just that other texts that come after the Pali Canon become much more important. I'm thinking in particular of the Lotus Sutra, the Heart Sutra, the Vimalakirti Nirdesa Sutra, the Flower Garland Sutra, the Lankavatara Sutra, etc., etc. None of these discuss the 5 hindrances in any great detail. One reason for this is that the variations of meditation practices and methods in Buddhism increase considerably as Buddhism develops and travels across East Asia. Similarly, new texts prescribe different types of practices to be carried out as well, such as making offerings to the sutras themselves, holding merit transfers for the community, chanting, doing visualization meditation, and so on. These don't replace meditation entirely, but they begin to eclipse it. For example, most Pure Land Buddhist practitioners don't do Vipassana, which is cessation meditation, because they do visualization of Amida's Pure Land and they chant the Nenbutsu. This is strongly related to one of the changes between the early schools and Mahayana schools that we've talked about extensively. We have often said that the Mahayana questions what is actually a useful or productive practice in a world without a living Buddha. And they have concluded in many cases that simple cessation meditation, or Vipassana, is part of the method of Dharma analysis that we've compared to the brute force method of password cracking, whereas chanting the Nenbutsu, or visualizing the Pure Land, is a much more analogous action to a phishing-based method of password cracking. They argue that both work, but one is a lot harder and takes a lot more time. The obvious response to them would be to ask them how they overcome the 5 hindrances to be able to perform visualization meditation, or to chant Nenbutsu. But that would get us stuck in a never-ending loop. In sum, the 5 hindrances are still a canonical part of the Buddhist teaching, but they're not dealt with in the text as much as could be desired, especially in the context of the Mahayana Canon.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode on the 5 hindrances. Join us next week where we will discuss sacred spaces in Buddhism. What are sacred spaces in Buddhism? What are their characteristics? How have they changed and stay the same over time? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, and we'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.